Death had a smell on this planet. It clung to everything: the air, the rocks, even the silence itself. And right now, that smell was getting stronger. The sky above looked like an open tomb, dark and endless, swallowing everything beneath it. There was no mercy in that sky, no kindness. Just a cold, empty space that seemed to mock anyone foolish enough to look up at it. The sun was dying somewhere behind thick clouds, and darkness was creeping across the broken land like a hungry beast. Rilke stood on the edge of nowhere, her torn cloak whipping around her in the bitter wind. The fabric was barely holding together, just like everything else in her life. She pulled it tighter, but it was useless. The cold cut right through it, biting at her skin like tiny knives. Her whole body hurt, muscles screaming, bones aching. Every step a reminder of how close she was to breaking. But she wouldn't break. Not here. Not on this cursed rock dot. The wind howled across the jagged stones, carrying with it the scent of dust and decay. It was the smell of everything that had died. Here before her, and there had been many. This place had a hunger for death, and it was never satisfied. She forced herself to keep walking, her violet eyes scanning the horizon with the sharpness of a predator. Every shadow could hide danger. Every sound could mean death. Her people had a name for this world, Venice. That the exiles, the ones thrown away like garbage, they called it something else. They called it the grave world. It was supposed to be a test, a chance to prove you deserved to live. But Rilke knew better. She had seen the truth in the cold eyes of the council that had sentenced her. This wasn't a test. It was an execution. Just a slow one. The air tasted like metal and bitterness. Every breath was a struggle, like trying to breathe through a cloth soaked in poison. The atmosphere was thin, barely breathable, forcing her lungs to work harder just to stay alive. The ground beneath her feet was cracked and dead, split open, like old wounds that would never heal. Nothing grew here except for the twisted plants that clung to the rocks like desperate fingers. They were sharp and hostile, as unfriendly as the world itself. This place hated life. It wanted everything to die. Her hand tightened around the crude blade she had made from the wreckage of her ship. It wasn't much, just a piece of twisted metal with a sharp edge, but it had kept her alive so far. She had broken it free from the burning ruins of her crashed vessel, the metal still hot from the fire that had nearly killed her. A sound broke the silence, a rhythmic clinking like stone hitting stone. Rilke froze, her muscles tensing like a coiled spring. She turned toward the noise, her senses sharp and ready. There, by the edge of a cliff that dropped into black nothingness, was something that shouldn't exist. A man. A human. She had heard stories about humans, whispered tales that made children hide under their beds. Her people spoke of them as wild beasts, driven by rage and instinct rather than reason. They were supposed to be mad, dangerous, unpredictable. Creatures that killed without thought and lived without purpose. But this one was different. He was building something. His back was turned to her, broad shoulders moving under a dirt-stained shirt as he lifted a massive stone and placed it carefully into position. His movements were slow but sure, like he had done this 1,000 times before. There was no madness in his actions, no desperation, just steady, patient work. His skin was dark from the sun, and his hair fell messily across his forehead as he wiped sweat from his brow. He wasn't just surviving here. He was making this dead place into something that looked almost like home. Rilke narrowed her eyes, stepping carefully over the loose rocks. She had been alone for too long to trust anyone, especially a human. Her boots made no sound as she moved, years of training keeping her silent as a shadow. Then, suddenly he stopped. His head turned slightly, as if he could sense her watching him. "I was wondering when you'd get tired of hiding," he said, his voice deep and rough, like gravel grinding together. Rilke's heart jumped, but she didn't move. How had he known she was there? The human Gabriel, she guessed from the faded markings on his shirt, slowly straightened up, rolling his shoulders like he had been working for hours. When he turned to face her, his expression was calm, but his eyes were sharp. He looked her up and down in one quick glance, taking in everything about her in a single moment. Up close, he was even more intimidating than she had expected. Tall and strong, but not in the wild, uncontrolled way her people had described humans. His strength was different, controlled, dangerous in a quiet way that made her skin crawl. She said nothing, just stared at him with suspicion and fear. Gabriel raised an eyebrow, wiping the dust from his hands on his pants. "You speak, don't you?" Rilke hesitated, then finally whispered, "Yes." A ghost of a smile flickered across his face. "Good. I was starting to think I'd been talking to ghosts." She didn't rise to the bait. Her grip tightened on her blade, eyes never leaving his face. He could attack at any moment. She had to be ready. "You're human," she said, making it sound like an accusation. He huffed out a short breath, tilting his head slightly. "Yeah, and you're not." Another silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Neither of them moved. Gabriel finally sighed, rubbing the back of his neck like he was tired of the whole conversation. "Look," he said, "if you're here to steal my food or wreck my shelter, just get it over with. Otherwise, I've got work to do." He turned back to his half-built structure, lifting another stone like she wasn't even there. Like she was nothing more than a shadow on the wall. Rilke's jaw clenched. "I don't need your help." His hands went still on the rock. But he didn't look at her. "Yeah? Then you're either very strong or very stupid." Anger flared in her chest like a sudden fire. "You know nothing about me." Gabriel finally turned, taking one step toward her. Just one. But it was enough to make her want to back away. She didn't, though. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "I know that wound on your leg hasn't healed properly," he said quietly. "I know you're favoring your left side to keep weight off it. And I know if you keep wandering around here alone at night, you won't make it to morning." She hated that he was right. She hated that he could read her so easily, like she was an open book written in a language he knew by heart. The wound on her leg was a mystery, even to her. She remembered the crash, the fire, the smoke burning her lungs, the weight of twisted metal pinning her down. She had pulled herself free and stumbled into the wilderness, but the details were fuzzy, scattered like the pieces of her broken ship. What she did remember were the creatures, the things that hunted in the darkness with too many eyes and claws. Like razors, they had found her when she was weak, when she could barely walk. They had almost finished what her people had started. But she had survived. She always survived. She took a slow breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "You have shelter." Gabriel nodded. "I do." "Food?" "Enough," Rilke hesitated. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to walk away, to disappear into the wild and trust. No one. But she had been starving for days, cold and alone, with nowhere to go. Her people had thrown her to this planet to die. The universe had made its choice. Now she had to make hers. Slowly, very slowly, she lowered her blade. Not completely, she wasn't that stupid, but enough that it was no longer pointed at his heart. Gabriel arched an eyebrow. "That a yes?" "It's a temporary yes," she muttered. His smile was brief, barely there, but she caught it. He stepped back, gesturing toward the half-built shelter. "Then I'd start helping if I were you." Rilke didn't answer. But she didn't walk away either. She had spent her whole life walking among towering spires of silver and glass, under skies filled with glowing ships that streaked between the stars like falling angels. Everything had been clean, perfect, beautiful. Her world had been a masterpiece of technology and grace. Now she stood in the shadow of crude stone walls, surrounded by dust and silence. The scent of dry earth was thick in the air, and there was nothing beautiful about this place. Nothing. Perfect. She had expected to feel out of place here. She had expected to hate every moment, to resent this primitive existence. What she hadn't expected was how alive this place felt. How Gabriel had carved something real out of nothing, shaping the dead land like it belonged to him, like he belonged to it. She shifted her weight carefully, still favoring her injured leg as she watched him work. He moved through the half-built structure with confidence, his muscles flexing under sun-worn fabric as he lifted stone after stone. It was mesmerizing. In a way she didn't want to admit, the efficiency, the control, the quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from him even when he wasn't speaking. She wasn't used to humans being quiet. All the stories made them sound like screaming beasts. Gabriel barely seemed to notice her as he worked, but she could tell he was aware of her. She caught him glancing at her more than once, his gaze flicking over her like he was trying to decide if she was worth the effort of conversation. She wasn't sure yet if she was. "You're just going to stand there?" His voice cut through the silence, rough but not unkind. "Or do you actually plan on helping?" Rilke narrowed her eyes. "I didn't agree to manual labor." Gabriel gave a short laugh, adjusting a stone with practiced hands. "Right. You think you're too good for it." She straightened, meeting his gaze with a sharpness that could cut through steel. "My people build with light and gravity fields." "We don't." She gestured at the walls with disgust. "Drag rocks around like primitives." His lips twitched like he found that amusing. But he didn't argue. Instead, he ran his hand over the rough surface of the wall, stepping back to admire his work. "Funny thing about primitives," he said quietly. "They survive." She didn't have an answer for that. The truth of it hit her like a punch to the gut. The wind picked up, kicking dust into the air. She turned away slightly to shield her face, but Gabriel seemed unaffected. He picked up a smaller stone and tossed it toward her. She caught it without thinking, her reflexes sharp despite her exhaustion. She shot him a glare that could have melted metal. He smirked. "Since you're staying, you might as well make yourself useful." Rilke considered throwing the stone right back at him. Hard. Instead, she took a deep breath and walked to the wall, examining where the stone might fit. She could feel Gabriel watching her, measuring her worth the same way she had been measuring his. She hated that it made her want to prove something. By the time the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, the walls had grown higher and the crude shelter felt less like a pile of rocks and more like something real. Something that might actually protect them from the dangers of this world. Gabriel sat back against a nearby boulder, pulling a flask from his belt. He took a slow sip, then offered it to her. Rilke hesitated before taking it. She sniffed the liquid cautiously. It had a sharp, metallic scent, like the filtered water she had scavenged from the planet's underground reserves, but with something else mixed in. Something unfamiliar. "It's safe," he said, watching her. "Pulled it from a deep well I found a few miles out. You'll get used to the taste." She drank, grimacing slightly at the bitter tang, but it was clean. That was more than she had expected from this place. She handed it back without a word. Gabriel tilted his head slightly. "So what did you do?" Rilke tensed. "What? To get sent?" "Here," he clarified, rolling the flask between his fingers. Most people don't end up on Venice unless they've really pissed off the wrong people. She clenched her jaw, turning her gaze to the horizon. The sky had begun shifting to deep purple, streaked with dying embers of red and orange. A world fading into night. My people believed I was defective, she said finally. The words tasted bitter, like the water. Weak, a liability to the greater whole. Gabriel didn't react. He didn't offer sympathy or meaningless words of comfort. He just took another sip from the flask and leaned back against the rock. Yeah, he murmured. I know how that feels. That caught her off guard. Rilke studied his face, but his expression remained unreadable. He wasn't telling her everything. Just enough. What about you? She asked. Gabriel exhaled slowly, tapping the flask against his knee. I killed someone. The words weren't a confession. They weren't spoken with remorse or pride. Just simple fact, like he was commenting on the weather. Rilke looked at him sharply, her mind automatically calculating how much of a threat he really was. But Gabriel wasn't looking at her. His gaze was distant, fixed on some invisible point, beyond the horizon. For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken things. Then he smirked slightly, finally meeting her eyes. Relax. It was a long time ago. She didn't relax. Gabriel chuckled, shaking his head. You think you're the only one who got thrown away. He gestured at the wasteland around them. This place is a dumping ground. Doesn't matter if you're human, alien, or something in between. If you don't fit, they toss you here and let the world finish the job. Rilke knew that truth too well. She looked at the rough stone walls surrounding them, at the small shelter Gabriel had carved out of nothing. He had survived here alone. That meant something. And yet, despite his isolation, despite the clear lines he had drawn between himself and the rest of the universe, he had let her stay. That meant something too. The fire crackled between them, its glow casting dancing shadows across Gabriel's face, across the stones they had stacked together. After a long moment, Rilke spoke. If you killed someone, she said carefully, why did they send you here instead of executing you? Gabriel's smile faded. His expression hardened just slightly. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. Because, he said quietly, sometimes exile is worse. Rilke held his gaze. She understood. For the first time since she had arrived. On this forsaken world, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she had thought. The first warning came in the wind. It started as a whisper, a distant murmur that stirred the dust and sent a slow, crawling unease through the air. The temperature dropped suddenly, unnaturally, as if the world itself was holding its breath. By the time the sky began to darken, shifting from dull grey to an ominous shade of black, Rilke already knew a storm was coming. Not just any storm, something violent, something that could bury them alive, if they weren't careful. She had spent enough time on this cursed planet to understand its moods. The way the land seemed to brace itself before disaster struck. The way the very air seemed to thicken with malice. Gabriel had noticed too. He stood just beyond the entrance of their shelter, his shoulders tense, his sharp gaze fixed on the horizon. The wind tugged at his shirt, lifting strands of his dark hair, as he watched the swirling mass of clouds rolling toward them. The storm clouds pulsed with a strange, electric glow. Not lightning, something worse. Something that made the hair on the back of Rilke's neck stand up. Looks bad, he muttered, more to himself than to her. Rilke followed his gaze, narrowing her eyes. The clouds were moving too fast, too purposefully. Like they were alive. Like they were hunting. How bad? She asked, Gabriel's jaw flexed slightly. Bad enough that if we don't reinforce this place, we'll be digging ourselves out of a rock slide by morning. She looked at the stone walls surrounding them. They were sturdy for now, but they hadn't been tested by something like this. And Venice did not forgive weakness. Without another word, Gabriel was already moving, grabbing what supplies they had. Rilke didn't hesitate. She fell into step beside him, ignoring the dull ache in her injured leg as they worked. There was no time for conversation. They braced the walls with additional stones, secured their fire pit so it wouldn't be snuffed. Out by the wind, checked their small stash of food and water. Every movement was deliberate, every decision made with the quiet, practiced efficiency of people who had long since accepted that hesitation meant death. The sky split open with a sound like the world breaking apart. A monstrous roar of wind, and rain slammed into them, and Rilke instinctively ducked back inside the shelter as the storm came alive. Rain pounded against their walls, seeping through cracks in the stone. The wind howled through the canyons like a living thing, filling the air with the sharp scent of wet earth and something metallic, something almost unnatural. Gabriel stepped in after her, shaking water from his hair. His shirt clung to him, damp, from the rising humidity, but he barely seemed to notice. He turned to her, his eyes dark and serious. "Stay inside," he said. "No matter what." Rilke bristled at the order in his tone. "I can handle myself." Gabriel exhaled sharply, running a hand through his wet hair. "I don't doubt that. But if something gives way, we won't have time for heroics." His voice was calm, but there was an edge beneath it, something just shy of concern. She didn't know why that unsettled her more than the storm itself. They settled into an uneasy silence, the fire between them flickering weakly, barely holding against the draft seeping through the walls. Gabriel pulled a knife from his belt and began sharpening it, the slow, rhythmic scrape of metal against stone almost soothing in contrast to the chaos outside. Rilke sat across from him, wrapping her arms around herself. She hated storms, not because of the cold or the wind or even the danger. She hated the memories they brought with them. She had heard storms like this before. Not on this world, but in another life. The night she was cast out, the council had stood above her, their cold silver eyes reflecting the glow of the city's towering spires. She had stood before them, bruised and battered but still defiant, as they passed judgment. Unfit, unworthy, expendable. She had pleaded not for mercy, but for the right to exist. They had turned their backs on her. Her own blood had turned their backs on her. And now she was here, trapped in the dark with a man who should have been her enemy. Gabriel didn't look up from his knife, but she could tell he knew she was lost in something she didn't want to say out loud. He didn't press, didn't ask. That, more than anything, made her want to speak. "They called me defective," she murmured. Gabriel didn't react at first. His knife scraped against the stone in slow, deliberate strokes. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. "And you still fought?" Rilke's fingers curled against her arms. "It didn't matter." Gabriel's gaze lifted to hers. "Maybe not to them, but it mattered enough for you to survive." She frowned, shifting uncomfortably. "Survival isn't victory." Gabriel held her gaze. "No, but it's the only thing that gives you a chance at one." The shelter shuddered as a particularly strong gust of wind slammed into it. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and Rilke tensed instinctively, her hand reaching for the blade at her waist. Gabriel noticed. He didn't comment on it, didn't mock her, didn't press. Instead, he simply continued sharpening his knife, the sound steady and reassuring in the darkness. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside their small shelter, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Rilke felt something that might have been safety. It was a dangerous feeling. On a world like this, safety was just another word for death. But as she listened to the rhythm of Gabriel's knife against stone, as she watched the firelight dance across his weathered face, she allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that maybe they might actually survive this. Reached into the supplies and pulled out a coarse blanket. Without a word, he tossed it toward her. She caught it blinking. Gabriel shrugged. Leaning back against the wall, get some rest, agitated. She wasn't used to kindness without conditions, but tonight she was too tired to question it. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders, listening to the storm, to the steady sound of Gabriel sharpening his knife, to the silence between them that no longer felt quite so empty. And for the first time since she had been cast into the void, she didn't feel entirely alone. The storm had passed, but it had left its mark. Raquel stepped outside, the shelter boots crunching against the damp, uneven ground. Air was thick with the scent of whetstone and scorched earth, a sharp contrast to the bone-dry stillness that usually hung over the nice puddles of murky water pulled in the cracks of the landscape, reflecting the dull glow of the fading sun. The world felt eerily quiet, kind of silence that made her skin prickle. She adjusted the grip on her knife and scanned the area. The wind had scattered debris across the landscape, small stones, splintered wood, even the twisted remains of something metallic that had been lodged into the cliffside, a remnant of an old wreck, maybe, or something else she didn't like. Unknowns behind her. Gabriel was already moving heavily, spared the damage of glance before crouching near their supply cache, inspecting what had survived the night. Looks like most of it held, he muttered, pushing aside a damp cloth to check the firewood shelters. Still standing, could have been worse. RKA flicked her gaze to him. He was tired. That much was clear. Faint tension in his shoulders. The way he rolled his neck as if trying to ease the stiffness there. He hadn't slept much, neither had she. She didn't respond, instead turning her focus to the sky. That clouds were clearing, but the deep indigo hue of night was already creeping. And how long do these storms last? She asked Gabriel. Glanced up. Depends, she sighed. You always give such detailed answers. That earned her the ghost of a smirk. He pulled a small metal container from the supplies and tossed it her way. RKA caught it smoothly, though her fingers hesitated slightly at the unexpected weight. Water, not much, but enough. Gabriel took a swig from his own flask before wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Storms hit fast and hard, but they didn't last long. We're lucky this one didn't bring anything else with it. She knew what he meant. The things that lurked on this planet were drawn to movement, to sound, to weakness. If the storm had uncovered something buried, if it had disturbed the wrong nest. Ari caroled, her shoulders forcing the thought away. We should check the perimeter. Gabriel nodded, grabbing his knife. They moved carefully, scanning the terrain for anything out of place. RKA took the higher ground, balancing along the uneven cliff side, while Gabriel moved lower, his eyes sweeping over the terrain with practice precision. Despite herself, Rilke found herself watching him, not out of distrust, but out of something else. Observation. Humans were supposed to be unpredicted, predictable, reckless. But Gabriel wasn't. His movements were deliberate, precise. He knew how to step without shifting too much weight, how to listen, how to keep his weapon at the ready, without making it obvious he was prepared to use it. He was cautious, controlled, not what she had expected. She forced her gaze away. By the time they returned to the shelter, the last light of day was fading, and the temperature was already beginning to drop. The fire inside the shelter had burned low, its embers glowing faintly in the dim light. Gabriel added more wood without a word, coaxing the flames back to life. RKA lowered herself onto one of the makeshift seats, a large flat stone that had been smoothed down by time and patience. She stretched out her leg, carefully flexing her foot to test thesiness still lingering in her muscles. Gabriel settled across from her, flickering light casting sharp shadows across his face. He didn't say anything at first, just stared into the fire. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was something else. RKA exhaled, tilting her head slightly. How long have you been here? Gabriel didn't look at her long enough. Not answer. Not really. She studied him, watching the way his fingers absently tapped against his knee. He did that when he was thinking, measuring his words. RKA leaned forward, resting her arms against her legs, and before this Gabriel finally glanced up, his dark eyes unreadable. She thought for a moment they wouldn't answer, then quietly, before this, it was a soldier. It was the first piece of personal information he had willingly given her. RKA absorbed that, watching the way his expression shifted, subtle but noticeable, a flicker of something that passed too quickly for her to catch. She didn't press, instead she nodded toward his knife, and now Gabriel smirked, faintly rolling the blade between his fingers. Now I build walls and sharpen things. RKA huffed a quiet breath, shaking her head. You're insufferable. Gabriel grinned. You're still here. She didn't have a response to that for a while. Neither of them spoke. Fire crackled between them, its warmth seeping into the stone, into the silence. Then, without thinking, RKA reached forward. It was instinct, a fleeting moment of curiosity, of something else. Her fingers brushed the edge of his knife, just where the blade met the hilt. Gabriel stilled. His gaze flicked to where her hand hovered nearest. He didn't pull away, didn't move, neither did she. The moment stretched unspoken and fragile. Then slowly, deliberately, Gabriel shifted his grip, turning the knife so the hilt faced her and offering. RKA hesitated, then took it. Weight was familiar, different from the weapons of her people, but balance solid. She turned it in her hands, testing the way it fell against her palm. Gabriel watched her, his expression unreadable. Definitely, she handed it back. Their fingers brushed as he took it. It was a small thing, barely a touch, but RKA felt it. Gabriel must have too, because for a brief second his breath hitched, then as if nothing had happened, he leaned back, rolling his shoulders. You should sleep. Ryla arched a brow, giving orders. Now Gabriel smirked, shifting to get comfortable. Just a suggestion. She did argue, but as she settled against the stone wall, pulling the blanket around her, she was aware of him in a way she hadn't been before, of the warmth of the fire, of the echo of his touch lingering in her skin. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long, long time, she didn't feel alone. The moment Gabriel stepped back into the shelter, Rin knew something was wrong. His movements were too controlled, too deliberate, like a man tried to mask pain. The firelight flickered against his face, casting sharp shadows over his tired features, and as shifted, she saw it, the dark stain seeping through his sleeve, spreading uneven lines down his forearm. Blood. She was on her feet before she even realized it. What happened? Gabriel exhaled through his nose, dropping his knife onto the stone ledge near the fire. His fingers flexed briefly before clamping down on his injured arm, the motion small but telling, ran into something unfriendly. He muttered, I'll live. RKA narrowed her eyes, stepping closer. His shirt was torn just above the elbow, the fabric soaked through the wound beneath. Wasn't fresh, it had been bleeding for some time. You should have come back sooner, she said, already reaching for their supplies. Gabriel let out a quiet, humorless chuckle, shifting to sit against the shelter wall. I had things to do. She shot him a sharp glare. Dying isn't one of them. His smirk was faint, but there as he let her push his sleeve up. The gash was deep, the skin around it already swelling, bruising at the edges. Not Abbott. A blade, maybe, or claws. RKA frowned. This wasn't an accident. Gabriel didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned his head back against the stone, closing high size for a beat. Didn't say it was. That wasn't an answer, and she knew it. But she also knew she wouldn't get more unless he wanted to give it. She pressed a damn cloth against the wound, and he tightened under her hands, his jaw clenching. Hold still, she ordered, not used to being patched up by an alien. He admitted, his voice edged with something unreadable. She ignored the comment, focused on the slow, steady movements of cleaning the wound. Not used to patching up a human, she counted, pulling out the small container of antiseptic she had salvaged from an old wreck. The silvery paste gleamed under the dim firelight as she spread it across his skin. Gabriel barely flinched, but She could feel the way he forced himself to stay still. It looks worse than it is. He muttered Ike wasn't convinced the wound was deep enough, that if left untreated it would slow him down on this planet. Being slow was the same as being dead. You need. Tourist, she said, voice quieter now. Gabriel cracked an eye open. You sound like Yoker, she scowled. I just don't want to drag your corpse into the desert tomorrow. That got a low chuckle out her theme. But he didn't argue. She finished securing the bandage, tying it off tightly before sitting back on her heels to study him. His face was unreadable. His dark eyes locked onto the fire for one him. Wasn't teasing, wasn't trying to deflect with humor. She hesitated and asked, what did this Gabriel exolid stretching? His fingers as if testing the movement in his arm. A mistake, he said finally. She frowned. A mistake doesn't leave a wound like that. He tilted his head, slightly considering her, then with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes, he said, you ask a lot of questions. Arkea crossed her arms. You give a lot of half answers. Gabriel huffed a laugh, shaking his head. Fair enough. Silence settled between them, broken only by the steady crackle of the fire. The storm had left the air colder than usual, and Rick adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. Without thinking, she could feel Gabriel watching her, not in a way that made her uncomfortable. Just aware you're good at this, he said. After a long moment, she raised a brow at what serving RKA didn't answer immediately. Her entire life had been about proving she could survive, that she was strong enough, fast enough, ruthless enough, and still, it had never been enough for her people. But here, in this ruined place, she wasn't proving anything, she was just living. You too, she said finally. Gabriel smirked. Yeah. I try. Another pause, then softer, more real. You sav my ass today. RKA met his it. G-days, something flickering between them, a shift, subtle but undeniable. She had been alone for so long. So had he, and for the first time maybe. Neither of them had to be. The wind carried the scent of damp stone and scorched earth, remnants of the last storm still clinging to the air. Brannis had quieted for now. But Rilke had learned that peace on this planet was always temporary. She sat near the fire, absent, sharpening her blade. The steady scrape of metal against rock was familiar, grounding across from her. Gabriel was doing the same, though. With less focus, his arm was healing, but he still favored it, adjusting his gripevery. So often the firelight flickered, casting shifting shadows along the rough stone walls. The shelter had started to feel less like a temporary refuge, and more like something real, something they had built together. Relo wasn't sure when that realization had settled in, but it lingered now, a quiet weight in the back of her mind. You always this quiet. Gabriel's voice broke through the crackling fire, casual, but edged with curiosity. She glanced at him. You always this talkative, he smirked, tilting his knife in his palm. Depends on the company. RKA huffed a quiet breath, returning her attention to her blade. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt easier than it had before. Less like two strangers sharing space, and more like something else. Gabriel shifted, rolling his injured shoulder with a wise. She noticed the movement, but he didn't acknowledge it. He was stubborn that way. You shouldn't be using that arm yet, she said. Gabriel shrugged. I've had worse. She set her knife down, leveling him with a look. And yet you're still an idiot, he chuckled, shaking his head. You wound me not as badly as whatever did that to you, she muttered. Gabriel didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for a flask at his side, taking a slow sip before passing it to her. She hesitated for half a second before taking it, the weight off gesture settling between them. She took a careful drink, the water cool against her throat, then handed it back. Gabriel leaned back against the stone eyes, flicking toward the dark sky visible through the cracks in the shelter. You ever think about what comes next? RKA frowned. Next, he gestured vaguely to their surroundings. We're not just surviving anymore, we're making this place livable. Feels like that should mean something. She hadn't thought it in those terms for so long. She had been focused on endurance, getting through the next night, the next fight, the next storm. The idea of building something, of looking beyond survival, had never seemed like an option. But now she looked around at the walls they had reinforced, at the supplies they had gathered at Gabriel, and she realized He was right. This wasn't just survival anymore. I don't know, she admitted. I haven't ever had the luxury of thinking about what comes next. Gabriel studied her for a moment, something unreadable in his gaze. Then quietly he said, maybe it's time. You did. She didn't know how to respond to that. Instead she reached for the flask again, taking another drink this time. When she handed it back, their fingers brushed. It was fleeting, barely a touch, but it sent a strange warmth through her, something unfamiliar and not entirely unwelcome. Gabriel must have felt it too, because his grip lingered just a second longer than necessary. Bo. He took the flask from her hand. Neither of them said anything, but something had shifted, something neither of them could ignore. The silence felt wrong. RKA had learned to read Vinius like a living thing, to listen to the wind, the way it carried whispers of unseen dangers. Now there was nothing, no distant howls, no shifting of loose rock, just the stillness of something waiting. She slowed her steps, instinct tightening in her chest. One hand drifted to the knife at her hip, fingers curling around thorn grip. Gabriel, walking a few steps ahead, sensed it too. He stopped without a word, his posture shifting. Weight centered, his good hand was already at his blade. They alone. The realization came a second too late. A blur of motion erupted from the shadows, fast, low to the ground. Too close. Gabriel barely had time to turn before something slammed into him, claws scraping against his jacket. He staggered but didn't fall, twisting at last second and driving his knife up. But the creature was already retreating, not a direct attack. A test. RKA spun at the sound of shifting gravel behind her. Another shape moved in the darkness, coiled tight, waiting for her to make the first mistake. Her grip tightened. Stalkers. Gabriel exhaled sharply. Of course it's stalkers. They weren't the biggest predators on Brennies, but they were some of the worst. They were patient, smart. They hunted in packs, wearing their prey down, striking only when the advantage was theirs. Tonight they had miscalculated. RKA moved first. She lunged at the nearest one, closing the distance before it had time to react. Her blade sliced through the air, catching its shoulder as it leapt back, a screech tearing from its throat. The rest of the pack took that as their cue. Another charge. Gabriel, but he was ready this time. He dodged, stepping sideways and slamming his forearm into the creature's ribs before driving his knife into its neck. The impact sent them both crashing into the dirt. RKA barely had time to register it before her own opponent struck. She twisted, ducking beneath a wild swipe, but it was too fast, too close. Claws raked across her shoulder, tearing fabric, slicing skin. Pain flared, but she didn't stop. She used the momentum to drip low, driving her blade upward into the soft underside of its jaw. The stalker convulsed, legs kicking, then collapsed. She didn't get the chance to breathe. Another shape, larger, faster, came at her from the side. She turned, but too late. The impact sent her hard into the ground, knocking the breath from her lungs. A weight pinned her down, claws digging into her arms. A sharp snarl too close to her ear. It had her. She fought, struggling against its grip, trying tug at an angle. Asterisk, anything, asterisk, but it was too strong. Then suddenly, it wasn't a sharp, brutal movement. The pressure lifted, and that creature let out a choked, gurgling sound before its weight slumped sideways. Gabriel, he was on it, dragging it off her, his blade buried deep in its side. It caroled away as he yanked the knife free. The stalker gave one last weak spasm before going still. Silence. Their breathing was loud in the stillness, both of them tense, waiting, listening. But nothing moved. It was over. Reela pushed herself upright, ignoring the sting in her shoulder. Gabriel was already up, scanning the darkness, knife still in his grip. His jacket was torn, dirt and blood streaking his arms, but he was steady. He turned to her, eyes sharp, scanning her like he was looking for something worse than what she'd already taken. You good. RKA exhaled, rolling her shoulder to test if it act, but she'd had worse. I'm fine. Gabriel didn't look convinced. He stepped closer, and before she could protest, his fingers brushed against her shoulder near the torn fabric. His touch was careful, just skimming the skin, but it still made her breath hitch. Doesn't look fine, he muttered. RKA swallowed, not from the pain, from the way his hand lingered from the way his gaze met hers, something unreadable behind it. She wasn't sure which of them moved first. The space between them was already too small, and then it was gone. Gabriel's fingers slid from her shoulder to her jaw, his grip gentle. But undeniable, he was close, now closer than they had ever been. His breath was warm against her skin. His heartbeat still unsteady from the fight. She could have pulled away. But she didn't. She didn't want to. Gabriel hesitated just for a second, searching her eyes for permission, or maybe for doubt. There wasn't any, so when he kissed her, she kissed him back. It wasn't soft, it wasn't tentative. It was desperate, like battle had stripped them down to something raw. Something neither of them had the energy to fight anymore. His hand tightened at the nape of her neck, her fingers fisting in his jacket, pulling him closer, drinking in the heat. The contact, the relief of being alive. When they finally broke apart, the air between them felt charged, something unspoken still. Lingering, Gabriel let out a slow breath, his forehead resting lightly against hers, while he murmured a smirk, tugging at his lips. "That's one way toss'll break, not dying." RKA huffed a soft laugh, though her fingers didn't loosen from his jacket. She didn't need to say anything, neither did he, because tonight they hadn't just fought together, they'd chosen each other. And for the first time, survival wasn't the only thing that mattered. The night stretched endless above them, a sky full of unfamiliar stars. Some burned cold and distant, others flickered softly, as if breathing in the darkness. RKA had spent her life beneath different skies, surrounded by towering spires and artificial light, never once looking up and wondering if she'd ever find a place where she belonged. Now she sat on the edge of a stone ledge, her legs stretched out before her, the warmth of the fire at her back beside her. Gabriel was silent, turning a small piece of rock over in his hands, his fingers tracing the rough edges. Absent-mindedly, the battle from earlier still clung to them, in the aches of their bodies, in the shallow scrapes and bruises, in a memory of almost losing something they hadn't been ready to name yet. RKA flexed her shoulder, testing the lingering sting of the wound. She earned a heal, she muttered more to herself than him. Gabriel glanced at her, his gaze lingering a second too long. "You always do." The words settled between them, quiet but heavy with meaning. For the first time since being thrown onto this planet, she wasn't just surviving, she was living. Because of him, she exhaled, slowly tilting her head to look up at the star swim. "I was a child, I used to believe every star had a home beneath it." She admitted that if you searched long enough, you'd find where you belonged. Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, then, "And do you still believe that?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "I stopped looking," he hummed low in his throat, thoughtful. "Maybe you were just looking in the wrong places." She turned to him, ready to challenge that, but something in the way he was watching her made the words catch in her throat. There was no hesitation in his gaze, no uncertainty. Tirila swallowed. "You built this place alone," she said, glancing toward the shelter they spent weeks reinforcing, carving it from the cliffs, shaping it into something more than just stone. Gabriel's lips curled at the edge. "That's not true," she frowned. "It was already here when I found you." He turned a small stone in his fingers once more before tossing it aside. Then he looked at her fully, his voice softer when he spoke next. "I didn't build it for just me," he admitted. "I built it for us." Rila's breath hitched. She searched his expression, waiting for the familiar flicker of sarcasm, for some teasing remark to follow. But there was none, just quiet honesty. She had spent so long believing she had been abandoned, totally alone, that her place in the universe had been decided for her. But here was Gabriel sitting beside her, saying he had built a home, their home, before he had even known. She would come. A slow warmth spread through her chest, unfamiliar and unsettling in the best way. She swallowed. "Hood, you should have told me sooner." Gabriel smirked, tilting his head. "Would you have believed me?" RKA hued, looking away. "No." He chuckled, the sound deep and knowing. "That's what I thought for a while." Neither of them spoke. The fire crackled, casting flickering light over the stone walls, over the home they had built together. Then slowly RKA leaned toward him just enough that her shoulder brushed his. Gabriel didn't move away. She wasn't sure how long they sat there like that, breathing. In the silence, the warmth of the fire, the weight of something neither of them had to say aloud anymore. But when Gabriel finally reached out, threading his fingers through hers, she didn't pull away because for the first time in her life she wasn't lost. She was home. The days stretched into something different. Their wounds healed, their bodies grew stronger, and the constant urgency of survival eased into something quieter. The storms had passed, leaving air warm, the sun golden against the jagged cliffs for the first time since being thrown onto this planet. Etty felt like she was living, not just enduring. She had spent so much of her life in control of her emotions, her body, her purpose, but now sitting by the fire watching Gabriel work under the fading light, she felt something else entirely, a slow burning awareness. Gabriel moved with an easy kind of strength, his bare back glistening with sweat, as he lifted another stone, placing it carefully into the wall he was reinforcing. She had seen him fight, had seen the sheer force he could unleash, but here, now there was patience in his movements, a quiet determination that fascinated her. "You always work this hard?" she asked, her voice carrying through the stillness. Gabriel chuckled. Without looking back. "You always watch this much?" Rila smirked, leaning back on her elbows. "Only when there's something worth watching." That made him pause. He turned, resting an arm on the stone, eyes locking onto hers. There was a heat in his gaze that hadn't been there before, or maybe she had just been too stubborn to acknowledge it. "You keep looking at me like that, RKA," he said, voice lower now, "and I'm going to start thinking you like what you see." She didn't look away. "I do," she admitted. Gabriel's expression flickered, something darker, more intense taking hold. The teasing edge was still there, but underneath something had shifted. Their fire crackled between them, but neither moved. And then, as if some unseen tether finally snapped, RKA crossed the space between them. She didn't hesitate. She stepped into his space, into his warmth, pressing her hands against his chest. His skin was hot beneath her palms, his breath hitching as she dragged her fingertips over the ridges of muscle. Gabriel didn't stop her. He let her touch him, let her explore his body, tensing beneath her hands, but never pulling away. "RKA," he murmured, almost like a warning. She tilted her head. "Do you want me to stop?" His fingers twitched at his sides. His jaw clenched. Then finally he moved. His hands settled on her hips, strong and grounding, pulling her closer until there was no space left between them. Their breaths mingled, the heat between them, thick, slow burning. "I don't want you to stop," he admitted, voice rough. She smiled. "Good," and she pushed him back against the stone, pressing her body flush against his. Gabriel let out a sharp breath, eyes dark with something unreadable, something wanting. He wasn't used to being the one overpowered, neither was she, but it thrilled her. She dragged her lips along his jaw, her hands running down his sides, feeling the tension in him, the barely restrained control, the way he was letting her take whatever she wanted, and she wanted all of him. His breath stuttered when she rolled her hips against his, testing, teasing. His grip on her tightened, fingers digging into her skin. "RKA," his voice broke slightly, and the sound sent a shiver down her spine. She loved it. She loved how he reacted to her. She pulled back just enough to look at him, her lips ghosting over his, her voice barely a whisper. "You always let a woman take control." Like this human. Gabriel let out a low, strained chuckle. "No," his hands slid lower, gripping her firmly. "But I think I might like it." RKA smirked, then stopped thinking. She kissed him, then slow but hungry, savoring the way he responded instantly. No hesitation, no uncertainty. His lips moved against hers like he had been waiting for this, like he had needed this just as much as she did when he finally flipped their positions, pinning her back against the stone. Instead she gasped, but not from surprise, from sheer breathless anticipation. The firelight flickered, casting golden shadows over their bodies, over the home they had built together, and as the night stretched on, they forgot about the stars above them, because right now the only thing that mattered was each other.